Hi guys, welcome to my channel. In this video, I am going to discuss with you the critical approach to literature, New Historicism. But before I begin, I would like to take a minute to explain to you the structure of this video and how I've divided it so that you can go straight to the part that you need. Alright, so no matter how weird it seems, I have not included the factual details about New Historicism in the beginning of the lecture. In the beginning of the lecture, I have given you the story of its origin, and then I have come straight to the 10 major arguments that New Historicists make. These 10 arguments I have of course broken down into 10 simple points, and I have given explanation and examples with each point so that they become easier for you to understand. After I am done with that, come the factual details. I have included the major proponents of the movement, their major works, and how the works represent the New Historicist practice. After that, I have given you some selected essays and some selected chapters from books with which you can understand New Historicism if you want to read it on your own, if you want to read it textually. Alright, at the end of this video, I have given you 3 best lectures on New Historicism that are available on YouTube so that you can get further clarification on the concept if you so need. New Historicism, as the name suggests, is a combination of 2 words, new and historicism, and points to the suggestion that this is a newer version of a movement called Historicism. So yes, that's true. New Historicism was an updated, revised, newer version of traditional historicism. And the new historicists were not really satisfied with the way old historicism tried to generalize an age, an epoch, a time period according to certain characteristics. For example, an old historicist would say that so-and-so was the spirit of the Renaissance, so-and-so was the spirit of the Elizabethan age, the Victorian age. The new historicists did not approve of this practice. For them, generalization of an age like this was not an appropriate way to approach history. Also, the new historicists were not really satisfied with the way the old historicists created a boundary between literature and history. For the old historians, history was primary and literature was only a supporting agent that was supporting their argument about history. So they placed literature in the study of history, and thus history remained primary. So there was a hierarchy, and history was above literature in this hierarchy. Alright, so New Historicism was a reaction against these attitudes. New Historicism was also a reaction against another approach to literature, which became popular in the 1940s in the United States and soon all over the world, of course. The name of this approach was New Criticism, which was also close to the formalist school of criticism. Both these schools insisted on the independence of a literary work. They believed that a literary work is independent of the author's background, the author's intention, the author's emotional state, as well as the historical background of the work, the social, political, economic conditions of the age in which it was produced. The new historicists believed that this approach was isolated and that literature cannot be studied in isolation. They also believed that the demarcation of boundaries that the new critics held between literature and history should be questioned, because even in the new critics' case, they had enshrined literature as something above and beyond history, something free of external factors. So we see a pattern here. For the historians, for the traditional historians, literature was below history. So they had marginalized literature. For the new critics, literature was above history. So the new critics had enshrined literature as something that transcends history and everything else. New historicists did not believe in both these approaches and therefore came up with a new practice which came to be known as New Historicism in the late 1970s and early 1980s in the United States. Alright, Michel Foucault, the noted critical thinker and major theorist who worked on power and discourse, and his revolutionary ideas affect almost all the theories today. But his ideas affected the new historical school a lot. And anthropology, the discipline of anthropology, the study of cultures. These two factors affected the new historicist school to a major extent, and the ideas that the new historicists came up with were mainly influenced by both anthropology and the ideas of Michel Foucault. So this was how new historicism originated in the United States and soon became a recognized approach to study literature and history. Now let's come to the first point that we are going to discuss. The first point is a phrase, a written phrase by Louis Montrose, a noted new historicist who has written in his Professing the Renaissance, the book named Professing the Renaissance, he had written that new historicists highlight the textuality of history and historicity of texts. And obviously this phrase has become immensely popular wherever new historicist practice is discussed. And this phrase became so popular because this explains the basic tenet, the basic notion on which most of the new historicist arguments are based. Textuality of history and historicity of texts means history is also textual and texts are also historical. Let's discuss this phrase by breaking it down into 2 points. The first is textuality of history. It means history is a narrative. History is a text. Whatever a historian chooses to write is a story that he chooses to tell according to his interpretation in the form of narrative through the medium of language. All right. So, as we know after reading Michel Foucault's discussion on power and discourse, that language itself is a power structure. The language that we use is already affected by the ideological power structures of the society that we live in. Right? So, number one, he uses language. Number two, history is a narrative. And number three, the narrative is dependent upon the historian's own circumstances, his point of view. So this is what it means by textuality of history. And the second part of the phrase was historicity of texts. That literary text is a product of the social, historical, political and cultural factors of the time in which it was produced. So this means that if you go on and read Charles Dickens, Thomas Hardy, you will know what was going on in the Victorian era. Even though you are not reading a historical textbook, you'll still come to know what was happening. If you go on and read Shakespeare, you would know what was happening in the Elizabethan era. And come to India. If you read what Mulkraj Anand has written, what Raja Rao has written, even what Amitav Ghosh and Vikram Seth and Arundhati Roy, the more contemporary writers have written, can you separate these literary texts from the history of their production, of the age in which they were written? It's certainly not possible. Separating history and literature is the one thing that new historicists do not approve of. And in the very first point, we see that by proving that history is textual and texts are historical, they erase the boundaries between history and literature, which the previous approaches, previous disciplines had erected. By breaking down the binary oppositions that the earlier approaches had created between history and literature, new historicists opened a new space of dialogue between history and literature, and new conclusions were now possible, and therefore the new historicist movement stands significant. The next point new historicists make is that the objectivity of history is a myth. While the traditional historians have tried to force this point on us that history is something that is factual and real and written from an objective point of view, new historicists state that an objective history is a myth. You cannot produce a historical narrative that is not affected by your personal opinions, your personal interpretations. A new historicist named H. Aram Wieser says, no discourse, imaginative or archival, gives access to unchanging truths or expresses inalterable human nature. So, those who think, now I'm describing his quote, those who think that any discourse, either creative discourse like literature or art, or archival discourse like history or records, those who think that these kind of discourses give access to unchanging truths or they express the real human nature are believing in a very simplistic version of history. This history needs to be questioned according to the new historicists. They need to know that the history that they are reading is the sum total of what the historian chose to say, chose to express, and how he chose to express it. So, therefore, the history that he is bringing to us is partially a subjective view of his interpretation of past events, and all history is partially a subjective view of the historian's manner of interpreting those events. Therefore, history cannot be objective. History is already always affected by a certain factors, and the historian's perspective and his circumstances and the society in which the history was written and the power structures that were in function at the time of its production are some of the factors that affect the writing of history. The new historicists, who mainly studied Renaissance literature, tried to show how the literature of the era projected the monarchy of the time in a particular light, in a particular positive light, and how the monarchy also encouraged that kind of theatre which projected them in a positive light. Also, whenever the monarchy was not projected in a positive light, the monarchy had concerns over that projection. So, already literature was being controlled very subtly by the structures of power. So, therefore, the literature of Renaissance that we read today is already affected by the ideological structures of the time. Alright, so those texts are also expressive of the history of the time, but that history is already manipulated, already affected by what the kings and queens of the time wanted people to see. The next argument that the new historicists make arises out of the traditional belief that history is a linear progression of events. Usually, the traditional historians maintained that what is history? It's a linear progression of events. Number one is linear, that event A led to event B led to event C, and event C led to event D. There's a causal relationship between different events, and the events are linear. That's one thing. And the second thing that traditional historians say is that history is progressive, that ultimately human beings have a tendency to improve themselves, and therefore history is progressive. The new historicists question both these beliefs, that history is linear or progressive. They say that this is a simplistic assumption. They believe that history cannot be understood simply as a linear progression of events. At a certain point in history, a given culture may be understood as progressing in some areas and maybe regressing in others. And also, what is progressing and what is regressing? Both are matters of definition. So, one historian may say that this is progress, and the other historian may say that this is regression. For example, take homosexuality. A right-wing, traditional, fundamentalist historian would critique homosexuality and would say that this is a wrong practice, a wrong tradition to follow in a progressive society. But on the other hand, if the historian that's discussing homosexuality is a left-wing, a person following newer ideas, accommodating discourses, he would say that of course homosexuality is not something that makes a person an outcast. So why critique it so badly, and we should welcome homosexuality. So, for the right wing historian, homosexuality is regression, whereas for the left wing historian, homosexuality is progression. So, how do you define progression and regression? So, therefore, any two historians may disagree about what constitutes progress and what does not, because these terms are matters of definition. Therefore, the argument is that the linearity, the simplicity, and the causality of history is also a myth, just like objectivity of history is. The next argument that new historicists make is that power relations are the most important context for interpreting texts. New historicism treats literary texts as a space where power relations are made visible. So, when you read Shakespeare or you read any canonical author, new historicists approach it not just to know what was the spirit of the age, like the traditional historians used to do, but to see how power relations are becoming visible in the work. According to new historicists, literary texts play an important role in revealing the power structures in function. So they either support the power structures or just reveal them, and they have the potential to subvert the power structures. The ideologies of the ruling class, the people in power, the ideologies of religion and politics, all these ideologies can be traced when we read between the lines of a literary text. And how do the structures of power yield this power through cultural modes? They define what's natural and normal, and whatever is inconvenient to the structures of power, they define that as abnormal, criminal, insane, uncivilized. And you remember how these exact adjectives were used? That's Dodo. She has some new interpretations and she wants me to add her voice as well because I'm marginalizing her voice, I guess. So, to continue, you remember how the imperial powers defined the people in their colonies as uncivilized, brute, animal like, and they used all these negative qualities to define them because that's what legitimized what they were doing. And you remember how the colonized people themselves accepted their domination because they thought that they were being civilized, that the white people's rule on their countries was a required phenomenon. So, this is the power, the discourse of power that Foucault highlights, and the new historicists have adopted, and thus power becomes the underlying idea. And tracing of power becomes the main objective of new historicist practice. But how do we know how power functions? And how do we trace that power is functioning in a text, either literary, cultural, or historical? So, here comes my next point, which is that new historicists focused on the study of marginalized texts and texts that have been silenced, voices that have been excluded, that have been ridiculed, voices that were considered too insignificant to be included in the mainstream history. In his essay, Counter History and the Anecdote, Stephen Greenblatt talks about E.P. Thompson, a prominent new historicist who took up voices that were considered too ridiculous to be included in mainstream history. So he brings in the Luddite Cropper, the deluded follower of Joanna Southcott, the utopian artisan, people who were not considered subjects by the writers of mainstream history. So, and why did new historicists want to include marginalized literatures, marginalized voices? Because they wanted to bring in a plurality of voice. See, as long as we read canonical literature and we read mainstream history, we are reading the singular version of history, the history from the dominant party's point of view. And therefore, we keep on following that history and not questioning that history. It is only by including marginalized voice and minor literatures, minor voices, minor cultural practices into focus that we realize that there is another version of a same event, that there are other narrations, other stories that counter whatever the mainstream history is saying. And this helps in reading between the lines because there's a new narrative in focus that is opposite or at least challenging the narrative that has been focus for ages now. And this is how the new historicists stay significant, because a plurality of voices that included an equal representation of historical narratives from all the groups helps ensure that a master narrative, a grand narrative, a narrative told from a single cultural point of view that claims to be the only accurate version of history, that master narrative will no longer control our present historical understanding. We will witness the plurality of voice and know the other stories that existed, and thus we will not believe in the grand receipt of mainstream history. It is owing to this inclusive insistence of new historicists to represent the marginalized voices that we study race, gender, caste, homosexuality, disabled narratives, and animal studies in mainstream academia today. It is because of cultural studies, which is partially an outgrowth of new historicism and cultural materialism, and both these schools of thought have played a major role in including the marginalized voices into focus. Another way in which new historicism traces the workings of power and ideology within cultural artifacts, within cultural motifs, is by taking text and context and studying them together. Here, literary text is not a primary object of analysis, and non-literary texts are not secondary objects of analysis. Here, both literary and non-literary texts are read parallel to each other, and thus they become co-texts to each other rather than being context to each other. Now, in order to study the literary and non-literary works as co-texts, new historicists borrow from anthropology a term called thick description. Now, what is thick description? Thick description is the study of the literary texts along with other cultural productions. Remember now, cultural production could be anything. It could be obviously a literary work, it could be a work of art, a painting, it could be a dance form, it could be a drama, it could be a cartoon show. But it also could be birthing practices, wedding ceremonies, rural games, penal codes, copyright laws. It could be anything. What I mean here is that thick description helps new historicists to read the text, the literary text in its context. How the literary text came to mean and how the literary text came to be interpreted in the way it was interpreted. Why a literary text meant this particular thing. And how do we come to know how this meant a particular thing? By studying all the cultural practices along with the literary text, because those cultural practices supposedly give meaning to that literary text. In the age, in the time in which it was produced, it got meaning along with the cultural practices that were followed in the particular era. So I'll give you an example here. Take for example Jude the Obscure, Thomas Hardy's Jude the Obscure. Now we know that this is a novel mainly about how religion, education and production systems suppress an individual, an ambitious individual, and additionally he is suppressed by the system of marriage, and how marriage puts a lot of pressure on the protagonists, both Jude and Sue. And therefore, to know what Jude the Obscure meant in the year it was published or the age in it was published, we have to study Jude the Obscure with all the cultural practices along. We have to see what was the actual state of marriage, what were the laws of marriage, and what were divorce laws like. What were the religious practices, and was the religious system in any case suppressive of an individual's ambition? were Cambridge, Oxford really that oppressive of an individual's ambitions? So we'll go to the history of these institutions as well and see what was happening during that time in Cambridge and Oxford. And do we need some anecdotes that tell us that yes, this account that Hardy gives of an individual's struggle in these renowned universities, is that true? So we can collect anecdotes, little stories, we can gather oral narratives. So you see how Jude the Obscure gets greater meaning and gets plurality of voice when we don't really rely on what only on what Hardy says, but we also read it along with all the other cultural texts that are available to us, and we treat the literary text and the non literary text as core texts, and none of them get privilege over another. And thus, well, where traditional historicism ignored or marginalized voices from the private life as something subjective and something that is irrelevant to mainstream history, new historicism tries to compensate for this omission by bringing issues concerned with private life into the foreground of historical inquiry. And this brings me to my next point, that new historicists included culture into the purview of history. We've already discussed this point in the other videos where I discussed the essay by Greenblatt named Counter History and the Anecdote. So I reiterate the point here that early historians, traditional historians considered, and especially Marxist historians, that production relations, state, ideology, hegemony, all these factors, all these characteristics were the only subjects of history, and crime, deviance, childhood, family relations, race, gender, all these issues were cultural issues and should not be included in historical narratives, history, creation of history. What was their topic of history? They were describing wars, monarchies, grand epic events, and of course, they were interested in knowing the spirit of the age. But Greenblatt defines new historicism as a criticism centered on cultural artifacts. So clearly, he was including culture into the purview of history. So, by including culture into the discipline of history, new historicists expanded the scope of history, and now private life was as much a subject of history as was public life. And this they did because so much of power play went on within private lives. And this was never included in mainstream history because they said it's culture, it's cultural. So we don't want to, include culture in our historical analysis, and we don't want to get into culture because culture needs to be stable. For example, in the Victorian era, women were supposed to stay home and raise family and be the epitome of purity and sanctity. And men were supposed to get out and earn and show some particular masculine traits. So, if we do not study this distinction and how this system is oppressive of women, then we never bring this marginalized voice into the purview of history. So, what new historicists did, they included these cultural practices and these cultural motifs into the study of mainstream history and thus expanded the view of history. The next point that I want to make in this video is our subjectivity, our selfhood, the identity that we embrace is shaped by the culture we are born in. And in return, the culture we are born in is shaped by our collective identities. All the people who are in this culture, in the society, shape the culture. So I know it's a little hard to understand, so I'll simplify it for you. My perception of myself, how I choose to define myself, what is the identity that I have embraced for myself, depends upon the culture I live in. For example, in the popular sitcom Friends, we see that the protagonists, the male protagonists of the sitcom, are afraid of there's a phobia of homosexuality. So when Ross's son plays with a Barbie doll, he constantly tries to replace that Barbie with a G.I. Joe toy, which is highly masculine and highly representative of the rugged American masculinity, which as a concept is advocated in America. So, what does this mean is that the character of Ross is a product of the American conception of masculinity. People like the character of Ross because he represents the same concerns which the American popular culture shares. So, number one, Ross is the representative of the American homophobia, the cultural homophobia that is pervasive in the American society. But watching Ross being homophobic, watching Chandler being homophobic, what the Americans learn, what the American males learn is that homosexuality is something to be afraid of, to be mocked at, to be made fun of. So you see how a cultural product is first shaped by the society, how the character of Ross is shaped by the American fear of homophobia and the American ideal of rugged masculinity, and how the character of Ross and the homophobia that he represents shapes the American identity, and how the people who consume that cultural product, people who watch Friends, think that homosexuality is something to be afraid of and to be made fun of. This is how culture produces itself, and a culture produces itself because it shapes the identity in a particular society, and the identities in turn shape the culture. It's a cyclical process. But new historicists maintain that although these processes are mutually constitutive, culture forms identity and identities collectively form a culture, both these factors are dynamically unstable. Neither culture nor identity is a fixed concept. Identities keep on negotiating, and because identities keep on negotiating, culture also keeps on shifting, keeps on changing. So while the traditional historian would ask a question: what was the nature of society, what was the nature of people in a particular period? The new historicist would ask questions like: what are the processes by which individual identity and social formations, such as political, educational, legal, and religious institutions and ideologies, create, promote, or change each other? So, this is the question that new historicists would ask. Our subjectivity, therefore, is not a static concept, a fixed state that this is who I am or this is who you are, but our identities is a process, a lifelong process of negotiation that carries on within a culture. Also, identities are constructed. There's only a limited scope in which identities are allowed to form, because our religion, our political system, our social institutions, our educational institutions, these are the institutions that control on who we become. See, for example, this lecture. I may be giving this lecture from a wholly personal point of view. The examples I give you are a subtle way in which ideology functions, right? So the characters that I tell you may be all from Western societies, because I don't want to tarnish the image of Indian society in front of you. So maybe that's one of the ways in which this lecture is also an ideological apparatus. So we have to be conscious of such ideology in operation, and that's the task of a new historicist, that we have to be aware of how power is played within cultural formations. And how does a society, how does the ideological apparatuses impose their power on us, how they impose constraints, limitations on us? Whatever is inconvenient to them, whatever is inconvenient to the social systems, they deem it as abnormal. They deem it as insane or criminal or perversion. So, what is legitimate, what is normal and natural is defined by the power structures, and this is how they control us. And we don't question them, because we have accepted these definitions as natural, because they have been so well ingrained in our culture. So the new historicists teach us how innocent looking structures can be a space where power play is coming into action, and how we can be aware of such formations. Now, I've mentioned the 8 points on which the new historicists received acknowledgement for bringing a new perspective to the field of literary and critical studies. But there's also one point for which the new historicists have been criticized by historians and critics alike. And that fact is that new historicists have been considered pessimist in their attitude, because they think that although power is everywhere and it flows in all directions, upwards and downwards, the subversion of such power is not really possible. Why is it not really possible? There are three reasons why it's not possible. First of all, wherever there is an attempt for subversion, and there are gestures of dissent and gestures of resistance by the subverting agents, it's often appropriated by the dominant structures. How they are appropriating is the 3 points that I am going to talk about. Number 1, the subversive forms are co-opted, they are assimilated, they are included into the dominant ideology, they are converted, and subversion is therefore avoided. Secondly, sometimes the dominant structures produce subversion in order to show that they can contain it and set an example. For example, an employer encouraging bad behavior so that he could fire one employee to set an example for the other employees. So the other employees would be afraid that if they replicate the behavior, they would also be fired. So this is how power structures create subversion sometimes to prove that they have the capacity to contain it. And the third point is, when the subversive forms, the agents of subversion, cannot be co-opted and cannot be contained, the dominant structure demonizes them as attempts to subvert the social order and then represses them while eliciting consent for this action by the larger society. What does this mean? That they create such a situation in which the subverting party shows resistance openly, and that creates some sort of inconvenience for the larger society, and thus the dominant structure takes consent from the larger society that yes, now this subversion needs to be controlled by force. For example, in normal classrooms, when a certain student is out of control and cannot be dominated by a teacher and disagrees to obey the teacher's command, the teacher tells the whole class that she will not teach further until the person steps out of the class. So here the student who's misbehaving is the subverting agent, and the teacher elicits consent from the whole class that the student steps out, the misbehaving student steps out of the class so that the teaching can continue. This is what a dominant structure does. It demonizes the agent who's trying to subvert the teacher's authority, and it's eliciting the teacher's eliciting consent from the rest of the class for her action. This is how power contains subversion in these 3 ways. And in the last instance, we see that power needs to have subversion. Otherwise, it would be without the opportunity to justify itself and to make itself visible as power. The teacher needs such students so that she can prove her dominant position in the structure of a classroom. And this is how she will make her power visible in the classroom. Now I come to the final point of this video, which is that in the absence of possibility of subversion, if subversive agents cannot subvert the power structures, what is the point of such a critical theory? What new historicists can contribute if they suggest that power can never be subverted? There is no scope for subversion. So the new historicists say that a historian or a literary critic should recognize that their writings and their interpretations are also subject to specific historical condition. They should be willing to question and examine the assumption behind their own interest in the past. They can describe the forces and processes through which power circulates itself. Also, the new historicists suggest that we should not believe in simplistic definitions and we should be skeptical of explanations that look smooth, linear, and unconflictual. And thus, we should understand the complexity of simple sounding concepts, and thus, we should avoid generalizing of an epoch, of nature, of human beings, of anything that seems to be a grand receipt. And finally, we should also view new historicism with the same suspicion with which the new historicists view the previous approaches. That's the motive of the new historicist way of thinking. Now, I would like to mention that whatever I said in the 10 points was a simplification, because my primary motive was to make you guys understand the basic tenets of new historicism. And of course, the new historicist critics would not like my act of simplification of their own concepts. So I advise you to first understand the concept through videos like this and then go on in further readings so that you understand the complexity and the layers that there are to the new historicist practice. Now, as promised in the beginning of this video, I'm going to give you the factual details of new historicism. So, first of all, I'm going to mention the proponents, the major contributors to the theory of new historicism. So, as we all know that Stephen Greenblatt was the one who coined this term, and the initiation of the new historicist practice is considered from the publication of his book, Renaissance Self-Fashioning, which was published in the year 1980. And in this book, Stephen Greenblatt makes the basic point which new historicist critics argue, that any age or any cultural trait is self-fashioning. The point that I mentioned about culture forming identities and identities in turn forming culture was initiated in this book. Alright, so there are many other books that Stephen Greenblatt wrote that shaped the way new historicist school went. These books are listed on the screen. The second book that was published in 1982 was The Forms of Power and the Power of Forms in the Renaissance. Then comes Shakespearean Negotiations, the circulation of social energy in Renaissance England, that came in 1988. Learning to Curse, that came in 1990. Marvelous Possession, the Wonder of the New World, came in 1991 and proved that the Western gaze of the colonized was always one of wonder. Then there was this journal called Representations that was started in 1982 and enlisted the main new historicists' ideas. So this was it about Stephen Greenblatt. Then we have Louis Montrose. He wrote Professing the Renaissance, The Poetics and Politics of Culture, and this book is also significant for the new historicist study. Then comes Frederick Jameson, who famously said, always historicize. His book, The Political Unconscious, Narrative as a Social Symbolic Act, came in 1981. There's also Alan Sinfield and Jonathan Dollimore, who mainly wrote books on cultural materialism, which is a close school to new historicism, but different in certain ways. So I have not discussed cultural materialism in this video because I think that deserves a separate video, because cultural materialism borrowed a lot from the Marxist school. So I have not included it here. So we must remember that Alan Sinfield and Jonathan Dollimore, although they wrote on cultural materialism more, still made contribution to the field of new historicism with their book Political Shakespeare, Essays in Cultural Materialism. Now, for you guys to understand this topic better, I'm suggesting some essays and some chapters in books or some short books that will clarify your conceptual understanding of the idea. So, first of all, a book by Tyson named Critical Theory Today, a user friendly guide, is a book that's an utterly simple version of these complicated sounding theories. So, this book might help a beginner to understand what this theory of New Historicism means. There's a whole chapter on New Historicism and cultural materialism. Then there's Professor Nayer's book, Contemporary Critical Theory, in which the chapter on New Historicism delineates all the major ideas propounded by these theorists. Then comes Patricia Wow, the modern literary theory reader, which was published in 1989. The chapter on New Historicism is a nuanced study of the New Historicist ideas. For book that I want to suggest to you, John Brannigan's book New Historicism and Cultural Materialism has helped me a lot to prepare this lecture, and I seriously suggest that you should go and read the book because first it explains the concept, then it explains the problems, and then it applies the theories, New Historicism and Cultural Materialism, to literary works. So it's a full package. Then we can explore a few other books that I've listed on the screen. The names I'm quickly going to read. There's D.G. Myers, The New Historicism in Literary Study. Harold Aram Weiser, The New Historicism in 1989. C. Dixon's book, New Historicism, written in 2005, and D. Feluga's book, General Introduction to New Historicism, written in 2003. These are the books that will help you in further understanding this concept and understanding the concept in all its complexity. Now, the next category that I promised was of YouTube videos. I have selected 3 YouTube videos that are going to expand your understanding of the concept and help you understand it better. Number 1 is Kalyani Vallat's lecture on New Historicism and Cultural Materialism. She explains it with many relevant examples and gives many factual details which can be of use to a student of literary theory. Then there's Pramod Nayer's lecture on New Historicism. He explains its associations with Marxism and other cultural theories. And the last one is a lecture on New Historicism by Yale University. It's a long lecture that explains New Historicism in all its complexity and a nuanced version of the theory. Now, I'm going to summarize quickly the 10 points that I explained in this lecture. The first point was that history is textual and texts are historical. There's no boundary between history and literature, and history is available to us in the form of texts, in the form of narratives interpreted by the historians. Second is that the objectivity of history is a myth. Third is the history that we have access to is neither linear nor progressive. The next point highlights that power is everywhere according to the New Historicist. It flows in all directions. No discourse is free from the workings of power. All discourses are the creation of power, and power constructs these discourses, and these discourses in turn create power. So this is the fourth point. The next point is that the New Historicists focus on the marginalized texts, to the voices that have been suppressed, to challenge the grand narratives of mainstream history. The next point says text and context are co-texts. History and literature, all cultural forms that are read alongside literary texts are co-texts, and New Historicists insist on a thick description of literary understanding. The seventh point says that New Historicists pointed that culture should be included in the discipline of history because culture is not free of the forms that pervade power. The eighth point says that culture and identity produce each other, they fashion each other. Culture produces identity, and these identities collectively then produce culture. Ninth is that the new historicists maintain that subversion is not really possible. Although we know that power pervades everything, the subversion of that power is not really possible. And why is it not possible? Because power either co-opts or suppresses dissent. If both these things are not possible, then power demonizes the subverting agent and thus takes consent of the society in suppressing that subversion. And last, that the task of the new historicist is to view everything, every discourse with a skepticism and question every concept that appears to be linear, progressive, and unconflictual. All right, folks, so that's all about what I had to say in terms of explanation of the new historicist ideas. I hope my video helped you, and if it did, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Thanks a lot.